Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with something slightly different. But before that, I'm just going to do a brief channel update. If you don't care about the channel update, just skip, I don't know, like 60 seconds to a minute in the future. I'm not timing this. Okay, so basically for the channel update, I'm having to throttle video schedule at the moment because there's not a steady stream of polls right now. The Canadian election, or Canadian series, Quebec series, the Canadian or Conservative leadership race series. There's just not enough new polls coming out in any of those to make an update. There are some, but not in a sufficient quantity for, I think, to warrant an update. There's not a large enough sample size of new polls, so I don't really feel confident in the trend for Canada specifically, and the Conservative leadership race and Quebec just haven't really had any polls that are worth mentioning about or are worth updating a model for. The US one, I have some more polls, but, well, I don't really want every single week to be updates for that in the middle of the summer. There's not enough people looking at it, and also there's just not enough things happening, and the polls are pretty consistent. Just a mild spoiler, this week the change in the U.S. is like 4 seats swing towards the Democrats, so not a lot. Some popular vote numbers moved around a bit. Again, not really interesting. Not really anything to talk about because all the issues are the same, really. The only interesting one is the recession, but that's... So we're doing something slightly different, and I think for many, there's probably going to be a couple more updates like this where I'm going to do something completely different than my normal content on a Sunday. I'm probably going to have to abandon most of the Tuesday and Thursday videos for the summer. I just don't have the time to come up with brand new or different things like this over the course of summer and also enjoy the warm weather. So, what it is... Oh, it turns out this was 2 minutes. Apologies. But we're going to get into this. So, what is this? Well, this is a new series I'm going to make. It's going to be a very sporadic one. This is called Anatomy of a Bad Poll. So, what is this about? Well, I'm going to dive through a poll that was released, especially a poll that gets a lot of traction in social media or a lot of people talking about it, and pointing to it as, this is an important poll, or a useful poll, or an interesting poll. But it turns out the poll is crap. I'm going to walk through it, explain why it's crap, and explain how you can spot it is crap. So, this poll in particular is from Angus Reid Institute, which is a shock because normally they actually release good polls. They have a bias, sure, but their bias is very predictable and the rest of the poll is very good. And to be clear, generally speaking, Angus Reid has an anti-liberal bias. Some people say it's a conservative bias, but they also wildly overpoll the NDP as well. So it's more of an anti-liberal bias than anything else. But this poll is really bad. Like, this is an embarrassing poll. I'm actually surprised they published it. So we're going to go through and why. So to start off, what makes this a poll? Well, like, what would throw a red flag here? So you scroll down, and right here, this is where the first red flag pops up. So it's showing federal vote intent for the CPC led by Schreier Poilievre versus the regular field. And the red flag here is it shows under Poilievre, it's a 5% lead for the Conservatives, and under Schreier, it's a 10% lead. Now, why is that a red flag? Well, the first thing you have to consider in polling is outliers exist, new trends exist and emerge and happen. So when you see a poll like this, especially when there's not a lot of polls being conducted of hypothetical aces like this, you have to look at comparable polls. So we pop over here, and we can see here, let me just zoom out a touch so we can see it a bit better. We can see here the list of hypothetical leadership polls that I've done. The important thing to note here, March 6th Leisure, Poilievre does better. April 10th Leisure, Poilievre does a lot better. July 17th Abacus, Poilievre does a lot better. Main Street, July 18th, Poilievre does a lot better. Angus Reid, July 18th, Poilievre does significantly worse than Charest? Wait a minute. So we have 5 polls over the course of about 4 months where Poilievre is outperforming Charest in a conventional election. The actual who's going to win the election and the leads don't particularly matter. All that matters is Poilievre is doing better than Charest. And suddenly we have one the other way around. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean by itself that this is a bad poll, but it is a red flag that you have to consider because this is a very astonishing result. It's actually a more astonishing result than this Main Street one, because the Main Street one suggests that either candidate is probably going to win a majority, whereas the Abacus and Leisure polls are suggesting probably a narrow Liberal minority for Poilievre and a Liberal majority probably for Charest, if Charest was running. So the Main Street one, which flips that, is actually less surprising because it actually continues the ordering, relatively speaking, between Poilievre and Charest, the same ordering, and actually the same difference in lead is pretty common, because this Leisure poll, that's a 6-point lead. This is about a 4-point lead. That's a 1 point. That's 1 point. So it's the same ballpark, maybe a bit aggressive for Poilievre, but in the same ballpark. And the order of how the parties do, especially if you consider like the other parties grouped here. Now, I don't know why they grouped other parties and made this a gigantic block here. Whoever made this table on Wikipedia really should do a better job. But anyways, moral of the story, the Main Street one looks like an outlier because it puts a very aggressive position for the Conservatives, but it's actually not that much of an outlier, whereas the Angus Reid one is because it flips the ordering of which Conservative leader is doing better by a lot. A 5-point lead for Charest is actually more than Poilievre leads in any other poll, except this one Leisure poll from April 10th, which is very old now. Whereas the most recent polls, all from July, all from almost the same time period, Abacus and Main Street both have Poilievre slightly leading, to a lot leading, and Angus Reid's the only one with the big lead. So this is a big red flag. Okay. So we already have a red flag here. So the first red flag means, well, let's keep scrolling down. Let's see. What else is there? Well, then we get this table here. And we see, oh, well, they're not including the other parties. So what are the other parties' vote intentions? Okay. So we actually go here, and this is the cross tables that Angus Reid publishes. And we notice here, they're not publishing the cross tables for the Greens, the People's Party, other, or didn't vote in 2021. That's really weird. Now, another recent poll, this is the most recent poll from Angus Reid, about a much less important or interesting issue, which is how people are affected by inflation. Really, like a completely minor poll. Like, this is actually kind of a useless poll, frankly. This poll, we go to the cross tables here. Oh, we have the Greens, we have the People's Party, we have other, we have do not vote, and we have how they support, how they feel about these different things. But in a really important poll hypothetical between two potential leaders of the Conservative Party in a general election, we don't get that. So that's a big red flag right there. Why don't we have that data? What the heck? Why didn't you publish it? And we get another immediate red flag looking at this. This is the 2021 vote. 457 Conservatives sampled, 467 Libs sampled. Wait a minute. There were more Conservative voters than Lib voters in 2021. Why did you undersample Conservatives? That's a really big red flag. That's going to bias everything in the poll. And since you haven't published the Greens, the People's Party, the other, and the do not vote, you can't actually reconstruct this poll. You can't reweight it yourself. All you can do... this poll is unsalvageable now because historically, for example, in the U.S. race, there's a recent YouGov poll. And the YouGov's wildly underpolled Republicans compared to what actually happens in elections. You look at, what's the word for it? When they poll people on election day, like when they actually poll exit polls, You actually look at exit polls, it's roughly 37, 38 Democrat, 35, 36 Republican, and everyone else is independents. This YouGov poll had about equal Democrat and independents in like significantly less Republican sampled. So what you do is you can reweight it, assuming that the sample was done properly. And then you can get new numbers. And that can increase the accuracy of a poll that is otherwise bad. Here, we cannot re-rate it because we don't have we don't have the Greens, we don't have the People's Party, we don't have other. So we scroll down here. Just a second, I'll scroll back up to do some other things, but we scroll down here to here. Well, we can't reconstruct this because we don't know how these other people would have voted. Well, that's a problem. Okay, so now we have two problems. They've undersampled conservatives, they've oversampled libs, and they haven't included three other groups. That's a big problem. The other really concerning problem here is they didn't include income or housing. Not housing, sorry, education or urbanicity. We look here, they have urbanicity, they have income, and they have education level. Every single Angus Reid, almost all Angus Reid polls conclude all of those. So this poll, not including things that they almost always include, they included this in a less important poll, not included here in a more important poll. Red flag. So for those at home, we now have 4 red flags. It's an outlier poll. It has 2 counts of less data than they normally publish. And the sampling is wrong for one really important one, which is previous vote intention. Previous vote intention is the most important category because it's the best predictor of future vote intentions. Really big problem. So then, well, let's scroll down. So what were the first questions they asked? Well, they asked people, who are you? Are you following the race? Okay, whatever. Then they pick a selection of policies that Poilievre said he's going to support. And they ask that to the panel. Then they ask, they're breaking this down for a while. Then they ask a bunch of policies that Charest said and breaks it down for the panel. But again, we're also removing significantly less data here. So why is this a problem? Well, first off, you have phrasing here. So, first off, embrace cryptocurrency Bitcoin as a way to avoid inflation is not what Poilievre advocated for. So that's just a complete straw man of his position. Poilievre wanted to allow people to use it as a currency. That's true. That's what he wanted to do. But by phrasing it this way, it looks more bad. Continue to support, or it looks more fringe. Or crazy, perhaps. Continue to support trucker convoy protests. Well, the problem with this one, again, I apologize. I'm going to be coughing for the next 500 years because asthma. Asthma and chest colds, not a good combination. So the problem here is the mainstream understanding of the trucker convoy protest is completely tainted by mainstream media actively lying about it, calling it like an illegal blockade, for example. Straight up lie. It's not an illegal blockade. It was tried to be injuncted. The court ruled they could not injunct the protest. In other words, the court ruled the city can't stop the protest by force. The only reason the protest was stopped is the introduction of the Emergencies Act, which means it could not have been stopped other ways. Because it was legal. It was a lawful protest. They couldn't stop it, the normal method of stopping a quote-unquote illegal protest. Therefore, it's a lawful protest. The railway blockades, those were injuncted. The people blockading or fucking around with the Coastal GasLink pipeline, that's had a court injunction put on it. We had COVID protests in Halifax, Nova Scotia, that had a court injunction put on it. This did not have a court injunction put on it. Therefore, it is a lawful protest. Now, you can argue in some of these cases maybe the court injunctions weren't proper. But the point stands. Doesn't matter if the court was biased or not. The court didn't do it, so therefore you can't say it's illegal. But without correcting this, or clarifying this, it gives people the wrong interpretation. And the other thing worth noting, too, is they have picked a relatively niche issue, the convoy protest, a relatively niche issue allowing Bitcoin to be used as a cryptocurrency. Again, it's still an inflammatory but still relatively niche thing. Fire the governor of Canada, or governor of the Bank of Canada. And they didn't pick other issues that I think are more mainstream and much less, mainstream is the wrong word, which most people probably support, such as putting minimum times to get certified, or to have immigrants certified in their skills, minimums on that, putting requirements that cities build a certain amount of housing to qualify for federal housing dollars, things like that, just name two, are much more, I assume, that's the wrong word, I imagine are much more popular policies that were not mentioned. So they have selected some of his less popular policies and ignored some of his more popular ones, and they have misconstrued his less popular policies to make them more unpopular. So that already frames this poorly. And the big problem with this is they're asking this before they ask your vote intention. They didn't ask vote intention, then ask these questions, then ask that to see how this would affect things. No, they didn't ask that. They just framed this. And we look at what they asked about Charest. GDP for military spending, allowing private delivered healthcare, nonsense garbage here, because it doesn't mean anything. What does fair equalization means? I don't know. A redundant promise, because this is already illegal, or criminal offense to blockade important infrastructure. That's already illegal, so you don't need to do that. It's redundant. And make another carbon tax, a different form. Those are the policies they picked. So they picked ones that, in this case, make a new carbon tax, as popular among liberals, which have oversampled. This is generally popular among people, but it's pointless because it's already illegal. This is redundant and pointless, but it's really popular among some conservatives in Alberta. This is popular, and probably a good idea, frankly. And this is popular and a good idea. So they've picked a bunch of things that are popular that he said, some of which are not policy. Like, you can't actually do that. Or it's pointless. Like, again, this is pointless. You can't actually do anything with this. Equalization as a concept is not fair, so there's no way you can make it fair. That's a whole other video. So they picked his most acceptable policies and not anything else. So they've picked things that the average person is going to like the most about Charest, and they picked the things that Poilievre is going to like, the average person is going to like the least about Poilievre, not because the policies are necessarily bad, but because of mainstream media narratives. And they framed this, so they've immediately biased the panelists with these questions. Super biased the panelist. And the ordering of the question means that the panelists are going to answer these questions before they give vote intentions. So you have biased the respondent. That's a huge problem. So now the answer of this poll, not only do we have an outlier poll, not only do they have two accounts of reducing data that they normally publish, not only do they missample 2021 voters, but now for a fifth red flag, they have biased the panel by asking biased questions about the two candidates. This is what I would do if I wanted to make Charest look good. These are the kind of questions I would have. These are the positions I would post. Not... And these are the ones I'd post for Poilievre if I want people to not like him. Or hurt him, because I'm not clarifying anything here. And then, I'm not going to go out and dig up all the policies that Charest supports that I think would make him look bad. That's not the point of this. This is the point to point out this poll was made to make Poilievre look worse and Charest look better to the panelists that have already been skewed. And we don't know how skewed they are as well, because again, we don't know what the sampling for urbanicity, income, or education are. And we know the 2021 sampling is skewed. So again, 5 red flags. We continue to scroll down here. Blah, blah, there's just about stuff like this. So then we get this one. Now, this will be a red flag in a moment. So, approval, disapprove of Justin Trudeau. Well, 80% out of Liberals outright approve of him. 4% are not sure, can't say. So, cue some funky math, and it's actually 83% support him. And how polling works. So, 83% Liberals approve of Trudeau, the incumbent Prime Minister. This is important. Because when we scroll down here, and this is Jean Charest, decided voters likely to support, 17% of Liberals are defecting Conservative and 15% are defecting NDP. If Charest is leading the Conservative Party. Wait a minute. 80% of Liberals approve of Trudeau. 80%. So why are only 64% voting for him? Red flag. That doesn't really make sense. Yes, you could maybe argue that some of the somewhat approve would like Charest more, but this poll doesn't demonstrate that. They don't post the data tables for that. And I strongly don't suspect that, because if you approve of Trudeau, barring the panelist not understanding what approve means, by saying you approve of Trudeau, you think he's doing an acceptable job. So if he's doing an acceptable job, why would you replace him? Doesn't make sense. So this is a big red flag here, because why? Why? It's also worth noting, too, it's pretty consistent. Poll over poll typically has about 80% of Liberals supporting, or Liberals voters supporting Trudeau. And if we go up here, that's the wrong one. I think we want this one. If we grab this Abacus poll, and we scroll all the way down to their cross tables, we look here, and look, 83% of Liberals support the Liberal Party. So 83% Liberals support the Liberal Party, and only 3% support the Conservatives. Okay, so we go here, we're switching Candice Bergen for Jean Charest, and 19% of Liberal voters no longer support the Liberal Party. What? That's a huge decrease. Unbelievable. Like, that level of decrease when this poll, again, this poll right here, says 80% approval. We go to Abacus. We ignore the data tables. And we... Oh, what did I just do? And we scroll back up. And we find Trudeau's approval rating. 34%. So he's actually less popular to Abacus than he is to Angus Reid. Let's see, is it by party? No, they don't have it by party, because of course they don't. But the point stands. So, in a poll registering a lower approval rating for Trudeau shows a higher amount of his voters still voting for him. Okay. Other huge red flag here. Really big. Well, two. First off, the sample size in Ontario is really small. That's another thing worth mentioning, earlier. The Ontario sample size is tiny. More importantly, you look at Ontario, Liberals and Conservatives are at 33 and 29. What? Like, yeah, sure, People's Party's at 8, but that's a huge difference. And this brings up, I'm just scrolling to Abacus for a second just to give a counterpoint. The Abacus poll, most recent one, 35 Liberal, 36 Conservative under Candice Bergen. This is pretty constant. 5 People's Party. So apparently, Charest going in reduces reduces the Liberal and the Conservative vote share in Ontario, increases NDP, and increases People's Party, and increases Green. It seems a bit sus, again. But we have another important red flag that pops here. We don't have a baseline poll in this poll. We don't know how the Conservatives do under Candice Bergen. This is a huge red flag. So you're telling me that Charest or Poilievre get certain levels of support, but there's no baseline. Because if you're doing this properly, what you should have done is you ask people, add a Q0, vote intention. Right now. Then do every other question. Because saying Charest or Poilievre would do this well without the baseline doesn't mean anything. We go back to this Abacus poll. Again, close these cross tables and we scroll back up. We have a Charest with Poilievre and with Candice Bergen. Okay, so they're doing it properly. They asked the baseline question, and they got a normal result. And by normal result, I mean if we go back to here, their result is roughly in line with the Leisure result. It's the Main Street result is different, but they have different sampling methods. They have different polls. That's different. But Abacus and Main Street, Abacus and Leisure are roughly on par. And again, this is still close enough that it's roughly on par. Here, we don't ask the baseline poll, and we get a wild different result. Other thing worth noting is this 26% support in Quebec seems unbelievable. Especially considering the Liberals at 23. I've not seen a single thing Charest has done that convinces me that Montreal Liberal voters will vote Conservative en masse. Seems unlikely. But I'm not going to throw that as a red flag. This is a yellow flag. This seems like the Quebec result seems unlikely, but it's not outside of the realm of possibility. This Ontario result seems unbelievable. Every single poll for Candice Bergen versus Trudeau has both of them well into the 30s. Typically, the range is 31 to 37 for the Liberals and 32 to 39 for the Conservatives right now, with Candice Bergen. So this Ontario is pretty big red flag here. We go to Poilievre. How does Poilievre do? Well, his BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Atlantic, they seem fine. Quebec, that actually seems plausible. This Ontario number, though, this is ludicrous. Doesn't make any sense. You're telling me there's a 3-way tie in Ontario? When has that ever happened? Seriously. I don't know if that's ever occurred. Let me just quickly pull up 2015, because this might be the only time this could have happened. I don't have this up because I'm not prepared sometimes. Even in 2015, where the Conservatives get dumpstered in Ontario, they still have 35% of the vote, and the NDP are not anywhere close. And if we go all the way back to 2011, with the best NDP showing, in Ontario, 26, 25, 44 Conservative. Again, old numbers, so not terribly relevant, but the point is, it seems extremely implausible that Ontario's in a 3-way tie. It just doesn't make sense. Further, doesn't make sense. The Trudeau numbers seem plausible here. The NDP numbers seem wildly implausible in this poll. Again, we don't have a baseline, though, so maybe under Bergen, the NDP do better, but it doesn't make sense that Poilievre running makes the NDP do better. Because again, against Charest, the NDP do worse. It literally makes no sense that the NDP do better with Poilievre running, nationally or in Ontario. The reason why that makes no sense, and why this is a red flag as opposed to other kind of flags, is, generally speaking, the more polarized the Liberals and the Conservatives are, the more likely NDP voters strategically vote Liberal. Poilievre is more conservative than Charest. Charest's a blue Liberal, at best. Kind of like a Morneau figure. So, if he's running, up here, it would actually make more sense for the NDP to do better with Charest running, because there's less incentive to strategically vote Liberal, because Charest is not going to do anything drastic. He's not going to unban the guns. He's not going to ban the carbon tax. He's not going to delete the CBC. Or other issues. I can't name all of them, but those are just some. So, there's much less things that the left-wingers could be really upset about if Charest wins. Poilievre's going to do all those things. So it actually makes more sense for the NDP to do worse if Charest or Poilievre's running. And the Liberals do better. Now, sure, the Liberals do better, but that's because their voters stay voting for them. 78% actually seems plausible. Again, 64 doesn't. So the final red flag of this poll is basically the Charest the Poilievre numbers actually look somewhat plausible, albeit the NDP ones are wildly ambitious. I would actually see this. The 22 is never going to happen. The NDP is not getting above 20 anytime soon. Not going to happen. Straight up not going to happen. But these Charest numbers are just, they're inane. They make no sense. They straight up make no sense. This column, wild. And also the NDP, 10% of NDP voters voting Charest also makes no sense. I just don't see it. Yes, there are NDPers who will flip conservative, and there are conservatives who will flip NDP. That's not implausible. NDPers more likely to vote conservative than NDP or Liberal with Charest? Charest is not much different than Trudeau. Like, objectively speaking, he's more moderate. That's the point of Charest. Like, he himself also agrees. The only meaningful difference I can see is he pretends, or at least rhetorically says, he's going to allow more private health care. But actually, that would be, in my mind, less likely that the NDP supporters support Charest, because most NDP supporters don't want private health care. So again, that's a yellow flag. The NDP one, that's not itself a red flag. The Liberal one is a red flag because this number seems unbelievable. There have been times when Liberals have lost a ton of support. I'm looking at you, 2008 election. Or 2011, for that matter. But this is such an unbelievable number. And those times when the Liberals lost a ton of support, it's because there was a very charismatic and successful NDP leader, Jack Layton. Singh is not those things. I don't actually know anyone who likes Singh. He has good approval ratings, but I've said this before and I'll say this again. Left-wingers and right-wingers understand to handle approval ratings differently. Left-wingers are more likely to say they approve of somebody even if they do things that are slightly they don't like, as long as they're mostly doing things they like, whereas right-wingers will happily say they disapprove of somebody who's doing right-wing things if they do one right-wing thing they don't, or one thing they don't want. A personal example, Tim Houston, the Premier of Nova Scotia, nominally conservative, seems, so far, is doing a better job than Ian Rankin did. But he does a couple things. For example, he introduced vaccine passports when everyone else did. I really disagreed with that. It really tarnishes my opinion. I rarely will say I approve of him because of that when I'm polled. There's a couple other things too, but that's the biggest one. Left-wingers wouldn't do that, typically. And this isn't just me strawmanning left-wingers. This is me talking to left-wing people. They normally don't construe things like that. They apparently construe things in like a balance of things, whereas right-wingers, like myself, are more likely to find one thing that they did wrong and be really angry about that. But then on the flip side, they're still likely to vote for the person in the election because the other options are worse. So that's why right-wingers always have worse approval ratings, because right-wingers will also disapprove of the right-wing candidate and still vote for them because there's no other options. So yeah, this poll is pretty sus. I think that's 8 red flags there that I've pointed out. I haven't counted specifically. I found 8 on Twitter, so I think I've run through all of them. So let me know in the comments below what you think of this poll. If you agree with me that this poll seems extremely sus, and in my case, I'm not considering it for all the reasons I've said. And if you disagree with me, I mean, by all means, articulate below. We can have a pleasant conversation. If you like this kind of video, let me know, and I can make more like this in the future. Otherwise, make sure you do the lovely YouTube things to help the algorithm, like and press the subscribe button if you haven't done it. But with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you probably next week.